Hello, I am Surgeon General, and this video will be a deep dive on the use of brand recall and a showcase of new brand recall tech that was made possible with the introduction of automation support in patch 3.24 Necropolis League. This technique provides a 50% more damage multiplier to characters specializing in recalling brands with relatively low opportunity cost. Brand recall is a spell skill that does not deal damage directly, but instead is just used to reposition all of your current brands and activate their effects. Its usefulness comes from the fact that while it is possible to cast up to 6 detached brands at a time, only 2 brands are able to be attached and active against single targets. By using brand recall, you are able to proc the effects of all your brands instead of just the 2 that are attached. The footage playing in the background provides an example of a character specializing in brand recall in a tier 16 60% delirious map with all increased effective map modifier Atlas passives. By investing heavily in brand recall cooldown recovery rate, it is possible to build a character capable of all endgame content primarily using brand recall. There are 2 aspects to brand recall based builds: the brand recall setup itself and the gem setup of the actual brands that are being recalled. Let's first look at brand recall. The brand recall gem is an instant use skill with a base cooldown of 4 seconds. Unlike most skill gems, the maximum gem level for brand recall is 6, and the gem gains 8% increased cooldown recovery rate per level. Quality also provides the gem an additional 1% cooldown recovery rate per 1% quality. Since brand recall does not deal damage directly, there is very little reason to support it with support gems, as there is no damage to multiply. However, the exceptions to this include Empower and Enhance, which each grant an additional 8% cooldown recovery rate per level past 1 due to the scaling previously mentioned. Let's now look at what brand recall will be activating. Any brand skill will work, but due to the specifics of Penance brand and Wintertide brand, they should typically not be used with brand recall. Penance brand should not be recalled because doing so prevents the branded target from reaching maximum energy and proccing the explosion. Recalling Wintertide brand will proc multiple instances of the damage over time debuff, but only the strongest of these will actually apply damage to the enemy, so there is no point to recalling all the brands against single targets. This leaves 3 remaining brand skills: Armageddon brand, Arcanist brand, and Storm brand. A major difference among these skills are their inherent activation rates. Storm brand has the highest natural activation rate for attached brands at once every half second, followed by Arcanist brand at once per second, then Armageddon brand every second and a half. For all of these skills, their activation rates scale with character cast speed. Here is a chart showing the activation frequency of each skill as a function of increased cast speed on your character. Storm brand is shown in blue, Arcanist brand in green, and Armageddon brand in red. Recall that the Runebinder keystone allows you to have a second brand attached to any single enemy, so I've included data for both cases where you have 1 and 2 maximum attached brands. 2 brands are the solid lines and 1 brand are the dashed lines. Most brand-based characters will take this keystone, so the 2 attached brands data should be the basis for future comparisons. Note that the lines for the single Storm brand and the double Arcanist brand are identical. Due to the faster base activation rate, Storm brand scales much better with cast speed compared to Arcanist brand or Armageddon brand. 75 to 100% increased cast speed is a reasonable amount for endgame characters specializing in the stat to pick up, resulting in about 15 activations of Storm brand per second. In comparison, Arcanist brand would only activate 7.5 times per second, and Armageddon brand 5 times per second with the same investment. Let's now look at the activation frequency that you can achieve for each of these brands using brand recall. Remember, the base activation frequency of the brand skill does not matter for this scenario. All that matters is the cooldown rate of brand recall, so the results will be the same no matter what type of brand you're recalling. This chart shows the number of brand activations per second using brand recall as a function of the amount of increased cooldown recovery rate on your character. Since recall activates all your brands, the activation rate depends on your maximum number of brands. Characters have a baseline of 3 maximum brands, but this can be increased by taking the brand mastery and brand equity Notable skill, which each provide an additional 2 maximum brands. Brand recall cooldown recovery rate is available in relatively large quantities on a few specific places on the passive tree, so endgame characters specializing in brand recall are typically able to get 250 to 300% increased recovery rate. At the maximum number of brands, this results in between 6 and 7 brand activations per second. Let's now compare the activations from brand recall and from attached brands side by side on the same scale. For Armageddon brand, the typical character actually is able to activate more brands per second by using the brand recall technique instead of just the natural activations from the skill. For Arcanist brand, the two styles result in about the same activation frequency given comparable investment in cast speed and cooldown recovery rate. However, for Storm brand, it is much more efficient to invest in cast speed than to bother picking up all the available recall cooldown recovery rate nodes. I should point out that it is possible to use both of these methods together, but it can be challenging to invest fully in both without giving up other stats like defenses. In summary, brand recall is most beneficial for brands with low inherent activation rates. For this reason, most recall-based characters will be using Armageddon brand of recall or Arcanist brand linked to a spell payload. So, how do brand builds end up being played? The most common way to implement brand recall in the endgame is to manually cast your actual brands and put brand recall into a trigger loop. The player will stutter step around, casting their brands to refresh their duration, and brand recall will trigger when it comes off cooldown. Prior to patch 3.24, this was most often implemented by either putting brand recall onto your left click so that it would auto cast when you moved, or by socketing brand recall into a weapon with the Veiled mod, trigger a socketed spell when using a skill. This made it so that casting your brand would also trigger brand recall, turning the playstyle into a one-button build. However, GGG introduced automation support in patch 3.24. This gem supports instant cast abilities and allows for them to be automatically triggered when their cooldown expires. Since brand recall is instant cast, automation support can be used to proc it with 100% uptime. The only opportunity cost for this quality of life is the use of an additional gem slot, which can be partially offset by also linking, for example, a guard skill to automate. You can verify that your automate brand recall trigger loop is working correctly by putting the brand recall skill on your skill bar and verifying visually that its cooldown is constantly ticking over while you have your brands out. While automation support removed the need for using the unveiled trigger mod in brand recall builds, there is still an exceptionally powerful use for trigger weapons on recallers. Examine carefully the bench-crafted version of the trigger mod. It reads, trigger a socketed spell when you use a skill with an 8-second cooldown. By default, the brand recall gem only has a 4-second cooldown, but if you socket a brand recall gem in one of these trigger weapons, that 4-second cooldown will be overwritten by the longer 8-second cooldown. Importantly, this longer cooldown is treated as the base cooldown of the skill. If you use a brand recall automate support setup, it will only have a base cooldown of 4 seconds. Since the two versions of the skills have different base cooldowns, they are treated as separate instances of the skills, allowing for both of them to be used at the same time. The cooldown of one of them will not block the other from triggering. This cooldown overwriting technique allows you to increase your number of brand activations from brand recall by 50%, with very little investment. You can check that this double brand recall loop setup is working properly by putting both of the brand recall instances on your skill bar, verifying that their cooldowns are listed as different, and watching their cooldown animations tick at different speeds. I will conclude with several closing thoughts to keep in mind when building around this brand recall technique. First, recalling brands spends a portion of their mana cost for each activation. Using the double recall setup will significantly increase your mana spend rate. If you don't have sufficient mana to activate all the brands, recall will go on cooldown, but it will not actually activate brands that could not be afforded. Common ways to circumvent the mana requirements include reducing mana costs with passive skills such as the Tireless Wheel and the Mana Masteries, linking your brand skill and brand recall to inspiration support, or instead spending energy shield with Eldritch Battery. Additionally, the base cast time for some brand skills can be quite long, so it is a good idea to invest in some cast speed to make the build feel smoother. Finally, the brand recall playstyle will result in bursty damage, since most of your brand activations come at the moment that the recall goes off. In contrast, building around the inherent activations of attached brands will result in a more steady state of damage. One version is not necessarily better than the other, but it is up to the player's preferences. I hope that this video has given you some ideas of tech that you can work into your own builds. If you enjoyed the video or are interested in more content of this type or in-depth build guides with an emphasis on mechanics, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support.